You think Soviet food was all gray meat and sad cabbage? Think again. While the USSR had its share of culinary disasters, Soviet home cooks created some seriously genius recipes that deserve way more attention than they get. These weren't fancy restaurant dishes. They were survival foods that happened to taste incredible. And some of them solved problems we still have today, like what to do with leftovers or how to feed a family on almost nothing. Let's dive into 15 forgotten Soviet recipes that absolutely need to make a comeback. First up, let's talk about dressed herring, or as the Soviets called it, herring under a fur coat. This sounds absolutely bizarre until you taste it, and then suddenly it makes perfect sense. You layer salted herring with boiled potatoes, carrots, beets, eggs, and mayonnaise. Each ingredient gets its own level, creating this rainbow tower of flavor that looks impressive and tastes even better. The salty fish cuts through the creamy mayo and sweet beets in a way that shouldn't work, but absolutely does. Soviet families made this for every celebration because it was cheap, filling, and could feed a crowd. Modern foodies would probably call it deconstructed and charge $40 for it at some trendy restaurant. But Soviets were making it in tiny apartment kitchens decades ago, proving that you don't need fancy ingredients to create something memorable. Then there's colladettes. And, yeah, I know what you're thinking. Meat jelly sounds disgusting. But hear me out on this one. You simmer pork or beef bones for hours until all the collagen breaks down, then let it cool into a savory gelatin studded with chunks of meat. Serve it cold with horseradish or mustard, and you've got this intensely flavored, protein-packed dish that uses parts of the animal everyone else throws away. The Soviets weren't making this because they loved gelatin. They made it because wasting food meant potentially starving later. Every scrap of meat, every bit of collagen, every piece of cartilage got used. And the result was actually delicious if you can get past the texture. Modern bone broth enthusiasts are basically rediscovering what Soviet grandmothers knew all along. Slow-cooked bones create incredible flavor and nutrition. Soviet potato pancakes, called syrniki, deserve way more recognition than they get. These aren't your sad frozen hash browns. You grate raw potatoes, squeeze out the excess moisture, mix with a tiny bit of flour and egg. Then fry them until they're golden and crispy on the outside, creamy on the inside. Serve them with sour cream and you've got a meal that costs almost nothing but tastes like comfort food heaven. The genius is in the technique. Squeezing out that potato water prevents them from turning into a soggy mess. Keeping them thin means maximum crispy surface area. Soviet cooks figured this out through trial and error, creating the perfect potato pancake formula. And the best part, you can make them with ingredients that never go bad. Got potatoes sitting around? You can make syrniki. No need for fresh vegetables or expensive proteins. Let's talk about cabbage pie, or kapustnik. This is basically a yeasted dough stuffed with sautéed cabbage, onions, and hard-boiled eggs, then baked until golden. Sounds simple, right? But something magical happens when that cabbage cooks down with the onions and gets encased in soft bread. The sweetness of the cooked cabbage, the savory onions, the richness of the eggs, all wrapped in pillowy dough. Soviet families made this when they had absolutely nothing else because cabbage was always available, always cheap, and stored forever. You could make one big kapustnik and feed 6 people for the cost of what a single fast food meal costs today. And unlike fast food, this actually tasted good and didn't leave you feeling terrible an hour later. Buckwheat with mushrooms deserves its own category of genius. Soviets didn't treat buckwheat like some trendy superfood. They ate it because it was available, cheap, and filling. But somewhere along the way, they figured out that toasting buckwheat groats before cooking them creates this nutty, complex flavor. Add dried mushrooms that you've rehydrated and sautéed with onions, and suddenly you've got a dish that tastes way more expensive than it actually is. The mushrooms provide that umami hit that makes your brain think it's eating something rich and meaty, while the buckwheat provides protein and substance. This was peasant food that happened to be accidentally brilliant. Modern vegetarians searching for satisfying meatless meals would lose their minds over this if they gave it a chance. Soviet bird's milk cake is one of those desserts that makes you question everything you know about what's possible with basic ingredients. It's a chocolate-glazed cake with a soufflé filling that's somehow both light and rich at the same time. The Soviets created this in the 1970s as a luxury dessert for special occasions, and it became so popular that every home cook developed their own version. The filling uses egg whites whipped to stiff peaks combined with condensed milk and butter, creating this mousse-like texture that melts on your tongue. Then you cover it in chocolate glaze and refrigerate it until it sets. The result is a cake that looks impressive, tastes incredible, and costs a fraction of what fancy bakery cakes cost. Soviet cooks proved that technique matters more than expensive ingredients, and this cake is the perfect example. Salted tomatoes are having a moment right now in fancy food circles, but Soviets were doing this for decades out of pure necessity. You pack tomatoes in jars with garlic, dill, and brine, then let them ferment until they develop this complex, tangy flavor that's nothing like a fresh tomato. These weren't pickles exactly, they were something else entirely. Slightly fizzy, deeply flavorful, and addictively good. Soviet families made them every summer because tomatoes were plentiful in August and non-existent by December. Fermentation meant you could eat tomatoes in February without paying ridiculous prices for sad, flavorless grocery store ones. And as a bonus, you got all those probiotics that modern health nuts pay premium prices for in supplement form. Soviet cottage cheese pancakes, called syrniki, are criminally underrated. You mix farmer's cheese with egg, flour, and a touch of sugar. Form them into little patties and fry them until golden. Serve with sour cream and jam. And you've got breakfast that's somehow both indulgent and protein-packed. The cottage cheese creates this texture that's denser than regular pancakes but lighter than cheesecake, hitting a sweet spot that shouldn't exist but does. Soviet cooks made these because cottage cheese was one of the few protein sources reliably available, and they needed to make it appealing to kids who'd rather eat literally anything else. Turns out, frying things and adding sugar makes even cottage cheese delicious. Who knew? Okroshka is the cold soup that confuses everyone who hasn't grown up with it. You mix chopped vegetables, boiled eggs, meat or sausage, and fresh herbs. Then pour kvass or kefir over everything and serve it ice cold. On paper, this sounds absolutely insane. In practice, it's incredibly refreshing and filling on hot summer days. The tangy kvass or kefir acts like a dressing, bringing all the ingredients together while providing probiotics and refreshment. Soviets made this because you didn't want to heat up your apartment in summer by cooking hot food, and kvass was essentially free if you made it yourself from bread scraps. Modern cold soup enthusiasts are reinventing gazpacho variations, but Okroshka beat them to it by about 70 years. Let's talk about Soviet mayonnaise salads, specifically the one called Olivier or Russian salad in other countries. The original Soviet version used boiled potatoes, carrots, eggs, pickles, peas, and bologna or chicken, all diced small and mixed with mayonnaise. Every ingredient was cheap, readily available, and could be stored for long periods. The genius was in the proportions and the dice size. Everything had to be cut to identical tiny cubes so every bite had a bit of everything. The mayonnaise bound it all together while the pickles provided acid to cut through the richness. Was it healthy? Absolutely not. Was it delicious and able to feed a crowd for almost nothing? Definitely. Soviet celebrations always featured a huge bowl of Olivier because it was expected, traditional, and honestly pretty tasty, despite being mostly mayonnaise and boiled vegetables. Pelmeni deserve way more recognition outside of Russia. These are little dumplings filled with ground meat, wrapped in thin dough, and boiled until they float. Think Chinese wontons, but with a Russian twist. Soviet families made these in massive batches during winter, then froze them on balconies where nature provided free freezer storage. When you needed a quick meal, you boiled a handful, topped them with sour cream and butter, and had dinner in 10 minutes. The meat filling was seasoned simply with salt, pepper, and maybe onion, letting the quality of the ingredients speak for themselves. Soviet cooks couldn't hide bad meat behind heavy spices, so they learned to make the most of what they had. And the result was these simple, satisfying dumplings that beat any frozen dinner you can buy today. Soviet fruit compote is the drink everyone should be making instead of buying juice. You simmer whatever fruit you have, dried apples, plums, berries, whatever, with sugar until the fruit releases its flavor into the water. Then you cool it and serve it cold or warm, depending on the season. The fruit itself becomes soft and delicious, making it a drink and dessert in one. Soviets made this because fresh fruit was expensive and scarce, but dried fruit stored forever and cost almost nothing. One bag of dried apples could make gallons of compote that provided vitamins during winter months when fresh fruit didn't exist. Modern parents spending a fortune on juice boxes should learn this recipe. It's cheaper, healthier, and actually teaches kids what real fruit tastes like, instead of corn syrup and artificial flavoring. Potatoes raisi are stuffed potato cakes that deserve their own food truck. You make mashed potatoes. Form them around a filling of sautéed mushrooms or ground meat. Bread them and fry them until crispy. The outside is crunchy, the potato layer is creamy, and the filling provides a savory surprise in the middle. Soviet cooks made these to stretch small amounts of expensive ingredients like meat. 1 pound of ground beef, when used as filling for potato cakes, could feed a whole family. The potatoes provided bulk and satisfaction, while the meat provided flavor and protein. Modern comfort food restaurants would charge $15 for 2 of these, but you can make a dozen at home for the price of a bag of potatoes and whatever leftover meat you have sitting around. Soviet apple cake, called charlotka, is possibly the easiest cake recipe ever created. You beat eggs with sugar, add flour, pour it over sliced apples, and bake. That's it. No butter, no oil, no complicated techniques. Just eggs, sugar, flour, and apples. The result is a light, custardy cake studded with soft apple slices that somehow tastes way better than the ingredient list suggests it should. Soviets made this because apples were often the only fruit available, and the recipe used minimal, precious ingredients like sugar and flour. You could make it in 30 minutes start to finish, and it impressed guests despite being almost absurdly simple. Modern bakers obsessed with complicated techniques should try this recipe just to remember that sometimes simplicity creates the best results. Finally, let's talk about Soviet condensed milk caramel, which people called boiled condensed milk. You took a can of sweetened condensed milk, boiled it in water for 3 hours, and when you opened it, the milk had transformed into thick, golden caramel. Soviets did this because sweetened condensed milk was shelf-stable and available, while fancy caramel sauce wasn't. The transformation felt like magic, and the result was better than any store-bought caramel. You could spread it on bread, use it as cake filling, Eat it straight from the can with a spoon if you were feeling particularly decadent. Modern caramel enthusiasts making complicated recipes with cream and corn syrup should try this method. Yes, there's a risk the can might explode if you let it boil dry, but that's part of the adventure. And the payoff is thick, rich caramel that costs about $2 and requires zero skill. The thing about Soviet recipes is they weren't created by professional chefs in test kitchens. They were developed by regular people facing shortages, rationing, and limited ingredients. These cooks couldn't run to the store for missing ingredients. They couldn't order takeout when cooking seemed too hard. They had to make something edible and preferably delicious from whatever they had available. And somehow, working within those constraints, they created recipes that actually hold up today. Modern cooking culture is obsessed with fancy ingredients and complicated techniques. We watch cooking shows where chefs use ingredients most people can't pronounce, much less afford. We scroll through recipe blogs that require 18 ingredients and 2 hours of prep time. But Soviet recipes prove that you don't need any of that to create good food. You need technique, timing, and respect for your ingredients. You need to understand how flavors work together and how to make inexpensive ingredients taste expensive. These recipes also teach valuable lessons about food waste. Soviet cooks used everything because throwing away food wasn't an option. Meat bones became kolodets. Stale bread became kvass. Excess summer vegetables got fermented or canned for winter. Nothing went to waste because waste meant hunger later. Modern households throw away nearly a third of the food they buy, then wonder why grocery bills are so high. Learning Soviet recipes means learning to see potential in ingredients others might discard. There's also something to be said for recipes that don't require rare ingredients or special equipment. Every Soviet recipe on this list can be made in a basic kitchen with a pot, a pan, and maybe a mixing bowl. No stand mixer required. No food processor necessary. No expensive gadgets that take up counter space and get used twice a year. Just basic cooking techniques that anyone can learn. This accessibility meant every Soviet home cook could make these dishes, regardless of income or kitchen setup. The flavors in Soviet cooking might seem unfamiliar to Western palates at first. Heavy use of dill, sour cream, and fermented foods creates a flavor profile that's distinct from Italian or French or American cuisine. But that unfamiliarity is exactly why these recipes deserve more attention. We've become so used to the same flavors and combinations that food has become boring. Soviet recipes offer something different, something that challenges your expectations while still being fundamentally delicious. What's fascinating is how some of these recipes are being rediscovered by younger generations who never experienced Soviet food culture firsthand. Food bloggers are posting about herring under a fur coat like it's some revolutionary new dish. Instagram accounts are showcasing charlotka as minimalist baking. Fermentation enthusiasts are making salted tomatoes without realizing millions of Soviet grandmothers were doing the same thing in apartment kitchens decades ago. The recipes are good enough to survive on their own merits, even when divorced from their original context. But context matters too. These aren't just recipes. They're survival strategies that happen to taste good. They represent a food culture that developed under extreme constraints and somehow created dishes worth preserving. When you make herring under a fur coat or potato grazy, you're participating in a tradition of making something from nothing, of refusing to let scarcity defeat you, of finding pleasure and satisfaction in simple ingredients prepared well. The Soviet Union is gone, but its culinary legacy deserves better than being forgotten or dismissed as bland poverty food. These recipes prove that restrictions can inspire creativity, that simple ingredients properly prepared can rival anything complicated and expensive, and that the best food often comes from people who can't afford to waste anything. So maybe it's time to bring these forgotten Soviet recipes back, not as historical curiosities or ironic throwback dishes, but as legitimate, delicious recipes that solve real problems we still face today. Because, at the end of the day, everyone could use recipes that taste good, cost little, use simple ingredients, and actually feed people satisfyingly. Soviet cooks figured that out decades ago. Maybe we should finally start paying attention.